Hi, everybody. Welcome to Great Lakes Now. We are having a watch party around our episode Water Damage tonight. It is broadcasting on Detroit Public Television in just a few moments, where you can watch it on your TV if you're here in Southeast Michigan. And also, this is our first joint watch party with one of our partner stations. WPBS in Watertown, New York is also airing the program at the same time. So you viewers that'll be seeing it, the viewers that'll be seeing it on air will be able to ask questions there in the Facebook chat and get their questions answered. I'm Sandra Svoboda. I am the program director of Great Lakes Now. We are out of Detroit Public Television, and I am honored to have a couple of guests with me tonight on this watch party. First, Tracy DuFlo. She is with WPBS in Watertown, New York. Tracy, welcome to Great Lakes Now. First live watch party around a double broadcast. We also have joining us David Ruck. He is in Muskegon, Michigan, and he is a video producer. He's with Great Lakes Outreach Media. David, welcome.
How you doing?
And we have Rob Sisson. He is with the International Joint Commission. Rob, welcome to Great Lakes Now.
Thank you. It's good to be with you tonight.
Yeah, and Rob, let me just start with you really quickly. I just wanted to ask a question. The International Joint Commission, that is a fancy sounding group. What is your group and what do you do relative to the Great Lakes?
Yeah, the International Joint Commission was created by the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909 between the U.S. and Canada. And the IJC is a body created by that treaty to help avoid conflicts between our two countries. And for the bulk of the history of the IJC, that has been controlling levels or setting levels of lakes and shared waters to be fair to both sides of the boundary. When there were dams, we had to approve those. Anytime there's a diversion of waters affecting the boundaries, we have to take a look at that. In the Great Lakes, the thing most people are familiar with the IJC is the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which is part of our purview.
Okay. We are going to see a couple of those topics addressed in this show. We coming up in the program that you'll be seeing on Facebook and on air and Facebook audience, you're able to ask questions about things you see. We're looking at the Midland Dam that, of course, burst in May and has led to some severe damage in those communities. We are going to look at the high water levels and their persistence in a Lake Michigan community. David Ruck actually produced that piece. And then the first segment you're going to see is about CAFOs, large animal feeding operations. David, what should give us just a quick preview of what the audience should look for in the CAFO segment.
Thanks, Sandy. I think the thing that two of the most important takeaways, I think, for that episode are, what impact are these large farms having on nutrient loading as it relates to Lake Erie. And another thing that should probably hover around in the background is what impact are these large-scale farms having on the small family farm? Certainly that's an issue we could dive into more, but those two things sort of hover around in that episode for sure.
Okay, well, what we do in Great Lakes Now in every program is this 30-minute show, usually 3 segments. We dig into issues of environmental science. We try to do recreation and culture, although I think we have a pretty serious show tonight on some issues and happenings around the region. But region is really the key. And what issues are happening in the Great Lakes that are unique to communities? Not so many of them, because we do find these issues like agriculture and water quality, water levels, of course, which are rising all over the lakes, and water infrastructure. And so I want to get a little bit of an overview of our New York audience with Tracy from WPBS. Tracy, where is Watertown, New York? You're joining us from Watertown, New York, and I'm just wondering, I've got a map behind me. Should I turn around and point to it, or can you describe for us where Watertown is?
Sure. Jefferson County is in Watertown is in Jefferson County, New York, and we are right on the shores of Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River, like kind of the mouth of the St. Lawrence River as it empties into Lake Ontario. So it's actually the Thousand Islands are there. If you've ever heard of the Thousand Islands, which are actually 1,800 plus islands. And it's a small community that's really big on tourism. big on welcoming people to our area, and lots of things to do.
Yeah. So here in Detroit, we are, of course, on the Detroit River, which is a connector between Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie. Further up is Lake Huron, and then all that water's got to go all the way through Lake Erie, Niagara Falls, or the Welland Canal, and then get to you on Lake Ontario. What are some of the biggest, we'll start with the issues. What do you see as some of the biggest Great Lakes issues for Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River there?
Well, of course, the biggest one was high water levels. We're still recovering from that. Some of the communities had to rebuild docks. In Clayton, the water got underneath some of the cement docks and heaved a bunch of stuff up, so they've got to fix that. And then cormorants have been a big issue as well. A huge population of the cormorant birds. They destroy a lot of trees and wildlife, and they're really kind of damaging the fishing industry as well. I'd say those two things. We've also noticed the last couple of years we've been getting some swans. So far they haven't really posed a problem so much, but who knows whether that's going to be something in the future that we're going to have to deal with.
Okay. If you're just joining us, I'm Sandra Svoboda. I'm the program director of Great Lakes Now, and I'm chatting right now with Tracy DuFlo. She's with WPBS. It's one of our sister stations there in Watertown, New York. We're also joined on the chat by David Ruck, who's a producer of a couple of segments in Great Lakes Now. In this episode, he's in Muskegon, Michigan. He's Great Lakes Outreach Media. And Rob Sisson is from the International Joint Commission. If you're joining us, you can see the format there on Facebook. There's a place where you can type questions. You can also type those during the show, and we will see those, and we will come back with a chat after the show to answer those questions. And, you know, I just might have a few of my own about what we see in the program. Even though I've already seen this, I might think of things to ask David about producing the first couple of segments on CAFOs and water levels, and about Rob about some of the water governance that we have between our two countries, because of course the Great Lakes are international. And, you know, here in Detroit, we're very used to that. We can look across the river and see Windsor, Canada, and oftentimes we see freighters that are coming through the Detroit River. So Tracy, your first work with Great Lakes Now back a year ago was from a documentary that you guys did about life aboard a freighter. Can you tell us about that documentary and then the two segments that came onto Great Lakes Now? Sure.
Back in 2018, we have a collaboration. We produced a program called More to the Story with Watertown Daily Times. And the idea came up to board a freighter and give a report on what it's like to live on a freighter. So I, along with one of my producers and a reporter from the Daily Times and the photographer, boarded the CSL Welland at Lock 7 in the Welland Canal. And we rode up with it through locks 6, 7, 8, or 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 through Lake Ontario, and then up the St. Lawrence River, where we disembarked at the locks in Messina, Eisenhower locks. It was a great experience. We met a lot of people, a lot of really interesting stories, and a lot of really interesting footage. We were able to fly our drone with special permits and lots of paperwork, and got some great footage.
And that documentary is available in full length, but then you also, because Great Lakes Now is a half-hour show, we had you guys produce two segments for that. So in our second episode called Ships and Shipwrecks, we saw life aboard a freighter, and then I believe it was last August, you guys produced a segment that was about the technology of freighters. That was pretty interesting, about some of the things they're doing for safety out on the lakes there. Was that part of your original intent when you went into that documentary, to focus on the safety, or were you more interested in the people when you started that, Tracy?
Oh, it was definitely a little bit of both. You can't really talk about the people without considering the safety of the vessel and how they live on a ship, and how the ship affects the environment and the safety of the crew. So it was definitely, we wanted to cover as many bases as we could in the hour-long show that we had to do, and I think we did pretty well.
Okay, so we have a comment on the Facebook page from Bernie, and I think I want to ask all our panelists to weigh in the 5 minutes we have before we go to the program. And Bernie's apparently looking at a map where he knows his New York geography. So I don't know, I can't see that right now. But he's wondering and says Watertown is not actually a Great Lakes coastal community. You're not on the water, but I think that does beg the question, what can you say about Watertown and your identity relative to the Great Lakes, even though you're not necessarily a coastal, right on the coast community, Tracy?
Well, we're only about 20 minutes away from Lake Ontario and about 30 minutes away from the St. Lawrence River. A lot of Watertown residents and residents of the nearby towns have summer places on the river. I happen to be one of those summer residents. I have a place up on the river and that I go to in the summer, and then another place in the rest of the year. And Watertown is, of course, the seat of Jefferson County. We do a lot of tourism for the area, and tourism is huge in the Thousand Islands, and we have lots of hotels and meeting sites and things like that. So yeah, we're definitely relating to Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River as best we can, because we have a lot of residents who live there.
I want to let Rob weigh in on this next. You know, that idea of a Great Lakes identity. Are we separate? Are we connected? You know, the IJC is a high-level policy governmental agency, but to what extent do the citizens' identities as residents of the Great Lakes region play into what you do there, Rob?
I think it plays very strongly. Last year, all 6 commissioners, 3 U.S. commissioners, 3 Canadian commissioners, were all put on, are named at the same time last May. And so because of the high water levels of Lake Ontario, we hit the ground running and spent a lot of time in the Lake Ontario Basin. But then we also were in the middle of a triennial cycle where we have to go out and meet with people around the Great Lakes. So we hit communities along all 5 Great Lakes to listen to people on their thoughts on how the governments, the 2 parties to the treaty, are doing in protecting and improving the water quality of the Great Lakes. And to say that people are passionate about the lakes, no matter whether they're on Lake Ontario or up in Thunder Bay, on Lake Superior, people are very passionate about the lake, and that carries through into public policy on both sides of the boundary. And I think in the Great Lakes Basin, we're blessed because that also carries through to the citizen activist and advocacy groups who really keep an eye on the quality of the water and how governments are managing them.
Yeah, that passion, I guess sometimes people just can't help how passionate they are about the Great Lakes. And I think, you know, that comes through for you, David, in your filmmaking. I mean, I don't think I'm putting too much on there, but what is it for you about the lakes that really drive you to make the films that you do about our region and the issues here?
Sure. Well, actually, to those public meetings Rob just mentioned, I think we produced the video that was like traveling around with those public outreach meetings at all the locations around, the kind of introduction piece that you guys were using to raise awareness and get people to come to those meetings. And me personally, I grew up on Lake Michigan. You know, it's really easy, I think, to take it for granted if it's something you see every day. But I personally don't feel like I did. It's like a family member, Lake Michigan, to me. And as you learn more about it and you learn about the fragility of the entire Great Lakes system, people that have never seen them before don't understand that you're not going to be able to see the other side of them. So they are vast, they are powerful when you see them, but human influence can play a huge role in what happens to them. We're seeing that with invasive species. We're seeing that with, just in the way people are responding to high water levels now. So,
yeah. So we are going to go to that segment. We have just a few seconds left. I want to remind the audience to please ask your questions on Facebook. We will come back after the program and answer the questions. You can always find us online at greatlakesnow.org. You can watch this video on our YouTube channel and subscribe there and get the latest updates. But please, please, please ask your questions in Facebook Live because we want to do what you're interested in. Thank you so much.
On the next Great Lakes Now, are your bacon and eggs to blame for Lake Erie's toxic algae blooms?
Over 85% of that is because of agricultural runoff, both fertilizer and manure.
Lakefront cities tally up the cost of record-setting lake levels.
Massive flooding everywhere in town. You lose sleep when that happens.
And what's next for communities flooded by the failure of the Edenville Dam?
There it goes.
This program is brought to you by the Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, Laurie and Tim Wadhams.
The Consumers Energy Foundation is committed to serving Michigan, from preserving our state's natural resources and sustaining our future, to continuing business growth, academic achievement, and community involvement. Learn more at consumersenergy.com/foundation.
The Richard C. Devereaux Foundation for Energy and Environmental Programs at DPTV, the Polk Family Fund, Eve and Jerry Jung, the Americana Foundation, the Brookby Foundation, Founders Brewing Company, and viewers like you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ward Detweiler. Welcome back to Great Lakes Now. You probably know that toxic algae blooms have become an annual summertime occurrence in western Lake Erie. Measures have been taken to prevent or shrink the blooms, but one factor that fuels them has been growing.
What's become the new normal is severe toxic algae outbreaks in western Lake Erie. That impairs clean water, it harms fisheries, it interferes with tourism and outdoor recreation, and it makes Toledo and Northwest Ohio a much less pleasant place to be. That should not become the new norm. That's not acceptable.
Communities relying on Lake Erie for water, income, and recreation have been battling toxic algal blooms for years. Most notably, in 2014, citizens were told, "Don't drink the tap water," for 3 days. 500,000 people were impacted. These toxic blooms are fueled by nitrogen and phosphorus, intended to feed crops. Both are nutrients which can boost productivity and profitability of farmers' fields. But when those nutrients wash off of fields, they can flow down the Maumee River and into western Lake Erie, feeding explosive growth of toxic cyanobacteria. On the one hand, Northeast Ohio is home to some of the highest agricultural productivity in the country. On the other, western Lake Erie experiences intense algae blooms every summer, fueled by agricultural runoff. The challenge is to prevent cyanobacterial blooms while maintaining agricultural production. Jeff Reuter is the former director of Ohio Sea Grant's Stone Laboratory and helped lead a task force which recommended reducing phosphorus loading in Lake Erie by 40% as part of Annex 4 of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement.
As the amount of phosphorus on a field increases, the amount of phosphorus that runs off from that field also increases. We can look at the load that comes in out of the Maumee River, and over 85% of that is because of agricultural runoff, both fertilizer and manure.
A growing amount of that manure comes from CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. CAFOs can house thousands of animals and, by some estimates, produce as much waste as the cities of Chicago and Los Angeles combined in the Maumee watershed.
That's CAFOs, that's concentrated animal feedlot operations with thousands and thousands of chickens and pigs and cattle. That manure is then spread on fields where it runs off, gets into the tributaries which go into the Maumee River, and then make their way into western Lake Erie.
Environmental Law and Policy Center in Chicago has been studying the impacts of a growing number of factory farms in Ohio. Senior research analyst Lucas Stevens co-authored a report with Environmental Working Group. Their findings indicate that CAFOs are largely unregulated sources of the nutrients which fuel algal blooms.
You can see our estimate of how much manure is being generated at all of the facilities that are in the Maumee River watershed. We found 775 animal feeding operations, and that's vastly more than are permitted in the state records.
Raj Bhajankawar is a physical scientist at the International Joint Commission. He helped lead the IJC report on reducing phosphorus loading in Lake Erie.
We cannot not have agricultural practices, which is important for this economy and, food production. But same time, we have to be very responsible in terms of how much phosphorus we put it in rivers and lakes. Through the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, 40% reduction on the both dissolved reactive phosphorus and the total phosphorus can reduce these blooms significantly.
Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and the province of Ontario, they agreed among them they would reduce phosphorus pollution by 40% by 2025. And they'd reduce it at sort of a milestone, 20% by 2020.
Yvonne Lasico is Ohio Farm Bureau's Vice President of Public Policy, which represents farmers and agricultural interests at the state and federal levels.
There's a lot of voluntary measures that farmers are undertaking, and then in addition, there's voluntary measures and research and programs that those farmers' member organizations like Farm Bureau are undertaking. We've been working collectively, not just with other farm groups, but with environmental groups and conservation groups, and figuring out how do we create baselines and how do we determine what are these best management practices that we can help farmers incorporate on their farms.
These are the best management practices, but these are all voluntary based. Nobody's enforcing them. There is no regulatory mechanism saying, hey, you can't do this.
And so the voluntary measures are ones that farmers, usually on their own dime, are looking at and saying, this is something that will work for my farm. This is either going to reduce how much phosphorus I have to put on, which is a cost savings, and this is going to reduce then how much phosphorus is coming off.
But according to Jeff Reuter, phosphorus reduction in the Maumee River has not materialized. Will voluntary measures be enough?
We've been trying to do it up till this point entirely voluntarily. And we've been trying to do this now for 10 years. So here we are at the end of 2019. Not only can we not see any we see zero progress.
Sandy Bin is the executive director of Lake Erie Waterkeeper. Her group believes not enough focus has been put on CAFOs and their nutrient contribution to the watershed.
Commercial fertilizer phosphorus has gone down by 30 to 50% over the last 20 years. And we're looking at the data and the science and seeing that the number of animals in the watershed has increased substantially by about 40% from 2005 to 2018, with a comparable increase in the amount of manure and a comparable increase in the amount of phosphorus. So if on one side we're taking it out and we're adding it on the other, this lake is never going to recover.
So in terms of them being mostly voluntary measures, that's actually not really the case. There are a lot of regulated items out there, including if you're a concentrated animal feeding operation, you have to have a permit to install and a permit to operate on an ongoing basis.
While there are regulations governing CAFOs, other farms fall just below the threshold of CAFO designation and avoid regulations altogether.
To be designated as a CAFO, if you're a dairy operation, you have to have at least 700 cows. If you're a hog operation, you have to have at least 2,500 pigs. Chickens, you've got to have at least 1.25 million chickens. There are certain regulations that you have to comply with. So if you have 2,499 hogs rather than 2,500, then you can do whatever you want. You don't have to have a nutrient management plan in place to prevent you from spreading too much manure on your fields. You're simply not regulated if you're below that size.
If they take their manure off-site, called distribution and utilization, they don't have to tell us where it goes. They don't have to tell us how many acres. So there's a huge discrepancy in that.
The Environmental Law and Policy Center has been working to identify large farms within the Maumee watershed, which have escaped CAFO designation.
We can identify the barns through aerial imagery because they are very, very standardized. What you would see from the ground is very nondescript. They're sort of low-slung, long barns. You wouldn't recognize it as a big factory. They cram as many animals as they can into these barns. They prefabricate the facilities, which are automated to feed and water the animals, and then take the waste and put it either in underground storage or manure lagoons on the surface. The number of animals within these facilities has been increasing at the same rate that the dissolved reactive phosphorus has been increasing over the past 2 decades. CAFOs produce millions of gallons of liquid manure. And the fact that it's already liquid when it gets applied to fields means that it runs off easier during rainstorms, but it also means that it's more expensive to transport, which creates the siloing effect of the manure being applied to fields closer to the CAFO, which means that it accumulates nutrients in the soil.
On the manure side, where it's, you could put in the soil 150 parts per million of phosphorus. That's not what you need to grow a crop. You need 40 parts per million or less. That's what the commercial fertilizer people use as their guideline, if you will.
Well, the problem is that our current guidelines allow too much manure to be applied, more than is needed for maximum crop production. So rather than fertilizing with the manure, really what we're doing is waste disposal.
If in fact it's to replace fertilizer, it should be having the same rules as fertilizer. And that's a huge effort that a lot of us are advocating for. And the response we get from meat and dairy is, you'll put us out of business. And no one wants to put them out of business.
Is it possible to reduce phosphorus levels to prevent algae blooms and have farmers make a living while producing our food? Chris Kurt is a corn and soybean farmer participating in a 5-year, $1 million nutrient mitigation project supported by the Ohio Farm Bureau and the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
I'll be honest, farmers don't always change easily. A lot of our farmers, they've done the same thing for a generation, and maybe it was passed on from the previous generation.
Think of it this way. I've been spreading my manure on this 100-acre plot here every year for the last 10 years. Suddenly, you're telling me that I now need to transport that manure a greater distance, and instead of spreading it on 100 acres, I need to spread it on 1,000 acres. That's going to cost more.
So if you ask a farmer, can they do more? And most of them are going to say, yes, tell me what to do. And then they're probably going to ask you, how am I going to pay for it? Because our margins are pretty thin as it is. So that funding issue is something that I think as a group, both farm and non-farm, we're probably going to have to work together to figure out.
How do we help them cover that cost of transporting the manure a greater distance and spreading the same amount of manure on a greater number of acres? They can do it voluntarily, we can give them incentives and disincentives, or we can create regulations to make them do it. Whatever we do, we're probably going to have to help them financially.
Joe Hammond is an organic dairy farmer who's been certified since 1997. He says the pressures on small farmers is immense to acquire more land and produce more per acre, and that as more farmers succumb to the pressures to grow bigger, maybe even to the CAFO level, the quality of the product and impacts to the environment will suffer.
Well, what we were talking about is the ability to vote through your dollar. If you're going to buy it from the cheapest discount place that just deals in quantity, you're going to support a farming system that's going to think in the same trail. If you want to pay that extra dollar, there's a reason for that, because those farmers are spending more time, more effort, and more expensive inputs to get you a quality product.
If you are ready to pay for it and put the pressure on your food producer to produce the food in a cleaner way, they have to change. It's both mutual, right? It's all about, the cost and responsibility.
That all comes right back out here to the field. What are they looking for and how do they want it raised? Fast and cheap? Or do they want something with some quality?
The health of Lake Erie could hang in the balance.
For more coverage of harmful algae blooms and their causes, visit greatlakesnow.org. We've seen more record high lake levels around the basin this year, and cities along the lakeshore are paying the price.
After several years of high precipitation, all 5 Great Lakes have been at or near record levels for much of the past year. Homeowners along the lakes have had to take expensive measures to move, protect, or demolish their houses before the waves or erosion could claim them. The high water threatens public property too, and along Michigan's Great Lakes shoreline, the longest of any U.S. state, many waterfront cities are facing mounting bills. The Michigan Municipal League has been tallying the cost of high water to the state cities since 2019, and the number is still climbing. Harrisana Richards is a legislative associate with the Michigan Municipal League.
Well, the number that we have, approximately $70 million, isn't complete. We are recognizing right now in this crisis that there's a shortage of people who are able to contract and do this work and also do those actual infrastructure projects. So you'll have a lot of communities, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, who are still waiting to get someone to come out and assess their damage and also get those estimates to really know where they are. And so that number has been growing by the day, by the month.
Waterfront towns like South Haven on Michigan's western shore have incurred millions of dollars of unplanned costs. The city is a favorite of summer tourists, but record high water has shrunk the city's sugar sand beaches. And on March 5th, the city canceled its annual July 3rd fireworks, a major tourist draw and economic driver. Not because of COVID-19, but out of concern that high water and waves could make it dangerous to launch from the city's iconic pier. Later that month, water levels hit another summer attraction, the city's marinas. Kate Hosier is South Haven's interim city manager and harbor master.
Boating and the harbor is pretty integral to the city of South Haven. We have 4 municipal marinas. The harbor is kind of right in the middle, like the heart of it, and the city wraps around it. It's a vital part of what makes South Haven South Haven. I'd say it's pretty important. There's a huge economic driver that is the port, with all the transient boaters that come in, from the seasonal boaters who stay here. On a normal July, every slip in this marina is filled by a boat.
But this year is different. In March of 2020, damage from the high water forced the city to close the 97-slip Northside Municipal Marina for the summer to make repairs and upgrades to deal with the high water.
We've shut this one down and are starting construction. So all these walkways, we're going to build them up about 12 to 13 inches. All the new utilities, all the new electric lines, water lines will be placed on the existing walkways. Then a new decking will be placed over top. So you're raising the docks and getting new utilities.
The closure and repairs are doubly draining on the city's finances.
By closing the marina, you no longer have the revenue, and now you have to pay for it. So you're kind of getting hit twice. You have to come up with the money to make the repairs, and then, of course, you're not getting the revenue because you can't have boats in the slips.
Necessary work at the city's 4 municipal marinas will be expensive.
I would say that the high water issues have caused repairs and fixes in the range of between $4 and $5 million.
Of course, the costs don't end with the marinas. On April 29th, after heavy rains, the city saw widespread flooding along its riverfront. Bill Hunter is South Haven's Director of Public Works.
That day, I was constantly running around worried. I kept checking all the spots. You lose sleep when that happens. Massive flooding everywhere in town.
The water was high enough to threaten the city's wastewater treatment plant on the banks of the Black River.
Here at this plant, this area was all underneath water, but we had these pumps here at the time, which helped us. We just had them installed. They only been running for a few weeks. Probably if that would have happened prior to the pumps, we would have had sanitary sewer overflows, meaning the sanitary sewer would flood into the Black River and to Lake Michigan untreated. That would be the worst case scenario.
Another worst case scenario? Treated water should exit the plant by gravity, pouring from an outfall pipe into the Black River. But the high water means the outfall pipe is submerged, which can slow the flow from the plant.
This is your effluent going out. The water, as you can see right now, is not flowing. In a normal year, you would just see the water like a creek going by, see the water just flowing. Now it's just kind of stagnant.
The city has had to run pumps to move the treated water out of the plant. Without the pumps, things could get ugly for anyone connected to the sewer lines.
If you cannot release your treated water into your outfall, all of that gets stuck in the plant. And since it's gravity fed and it can't push out, that means it stays stuck in the plant And all the stuff that's being pumped into your system from lift stations, from homes, from businesses, stays in the line, or if it can't move, it gets backed up into people's houses. Nobody wants sewer in their house.
The wastewater treatment plant is now protected by lines of HESCO barriers, sand-filled containers that form a wall to stop water and waves. In May, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers helped to install more barriers on South Haven's waterfront, but they aren't protecting the beach. They're protecting the city's water filtration plant and a critical 1 million gallon reservoir of drinking water that's buried beneath the sand.
If you don't have that holding tank, you basically have to issue a system-wide boil notice. So all 11,000 people would have to immediately start boiling their water to be able to use.
Elsewhere in the community, flooding has remained a problem. Around the intersection of Dunkley and Wells, the spring floods never left.
That whole area is still flooded. We have 2 pumps already in there to dewater the area. We did that last year. This year, those pumps can't keep up, so we're proposing to put in more sandbags plus the Tiger Dam system. That's an $82,000 expense, not budgeted.
Early estimates put the total cost at $11 to $20 million. As of early July, the high end of that range is looking more accurate. Of course, these problems are not without precedent. In 1986, during the last round of record-setting water levels, governments asked the International Joint Commission to prepare a report and recommend actions. Rob Sisson is one of the IJC's U.S. commissioners.
When you read through it, the theme of climate change comes through loud and clear, coastal resiliency, a lot of recommendations for infrastructure for municipalities around the Great Lakes, and those largely have sat on a shelf for the intervening years because the water levels came right down.
Sisson hopes that this time, lessons learned will be acted upon.
I know communities are hurting and they're going to need millions and millions of dollars of assistance to bring their systems up to speed. It's going to be more than local governments can handle. The high water emergency that exists today does give us, I think, the ability to bring governments together and stakeholders together to discuss, let's put a plan in place for the long term. Let's get together, let's build a resiliency plan for the future because we know we're going to face higher highs and lower lows in the future.
For more coverage of this year's high water levels, visit us at greatlakesnow.org. There are thousands of dams in the states and provinces surrounding the Great Lakes. In May, the Edenville Dam near Midland, Michigan failed, 2 years after regulators pulled its license, citing safety concerns. We asked 2 journalists from the news site MLive to tell us what they saw covering the story.
They knew that, rain was coming, it was an area prone to flooding.
We had all that huge rain and it was just inevitable. Everybody got an emergency alert on their phone saying, get out now, evacuate immediately.
The failure of the Edenville Dam on May 19th was captured on video.
There it goes. There it goes.
The 21.5 billion gallons of water in Wixom Lake poured through the breached dam.
There we go, there's the rush.
Wixom Lake floods out and it's pushing out into the Tittabawassee River.
There was just crazy amounts of debris, trees, pontoon boats. I mean, it was just insane how much debris was being pulled with all this water pressure just dragging everything along with it.
The floodwater and debris rushed downstream, 7 miles to the Sanford Dam, which was quickly overtopped.
The water started to overflow, started to breach the dam, and we ended up getting evacuated out of there shortly after that, before it actually failed. The whole town of Sanford was underwater.
When the floodwater finally drained to Lake Huron, Wixom and Sanford lakes were empty, and the town of Sanford was in bad shape.
Most of their downtown is just completely destroyed, or the buildings are marked for demolition. Roads are completely, just riddled and washed up. Houses completely gone. Right now, a lot of the Community is in the process of, working with FEMA, working with their insurance companies, seeing, how they can, get some help. Right now you have some high-profile lawyers, and they're filing what's called mass tort lawsuits, against the dam owners.
The failures have also raised concerns about dam safety around Michigan and the Great Lakes region. MLive has reported on the long history of conflict between federal regulators and the dam's owners, and Great Lakes Now has covered the story on our website.
We looked at how Michigan's dam safety department compares to other states around the Great Lakes, and the answer is it's got fewer staff and less funding. We also reported on how a combination of climate change and poor infrastructure played a major part in the dam breach. The Midland Dam incident is just one snapshot of a much larger picture.
Thanks for watching. You can find coverage of the Midland Dam story by Great Lakes Now and MLive at greatlakesnow.org. When you get there, you can follow us on social media or subscribe to our newsletter to get updates about our work. See you out on the lakes.
This program is brought to you by the Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, Laurie and Tim Wadhams.
The Consumers Energy Foundation is committed to serving Michigan, from preserving our state's natural resources and sustaining our future, to continuing business growth, academic achievement, and community involvement. Learn more at consumersenergy.com/foundation.
The Richard C. Devereaux Foundation for Energy and Environmental Programs at DPTV, the Polk Family Fund, Eve and Jerry Jung, the Americana Foundation, the Brookby Foundation, Founders Brewing Company, and viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, everybody, welcome back to our Facebook watch party. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I know those were some pretty serious topics. Normally with Great Lakes Now, we like to bring you something that's a little bit fun, but all of those were really important issues and happening this summer. I'm Sandra Svoboda. I'm the program director, and I'm joined on this chat by Tracy DuFlo. She's with WPBS. They are broadcast in Watertown, New York. They're broadcasting the show at the same time. So welcome to our New York audience that's watching. And then David Ruck, who produced the first two segments that you just saw, one about CAFOs, and he did the videography and work on the South Haven water levels. And then we also have Rob Sisson, who was in the segment. He is with the International Joint Commission. So let's stay with Rob. We had a couple of questions from audience members related to both the CAFOs and the water levels. So let's just start with the dams. To what extent do we see the dams as an issue around the region, and how are they related to water levels in the Great Lakes as well?
Yeah, good question, Sandy. Yeah, I think the Edenville Dam represents several different issues going on in the basin. First, I think it's been widely reported that there was deferred maintenance and infrastructure improvements required there that the investment was not made to bring the dam up to current, safe specifications. We see this throughout the basin in municipal infrastructure systems and other private infrastructure, where the cost of maintaining these systems and properly reinvesting in them is so great that often it's deferred for quite a while. We just saw the segment on South Haven, which is really a poster child because they're on the front lines, and you can look at communities all around the Great Lakes. Last year, Clayton, New York would have been a great example of how water levels impact infrastructure and operations in municipalities. But I'm from Sturgis, Michigan, which is 3 counties in from Lake Michigan, and yet our wastewater and stormwater system empties into a drain that goes into a tributary to Lake Michigan. So this infrastructure maintenance and reinvestment is an issue throughout the basin, not just on the coast. Then I think the other aspect is NOAA tracks rainfall and precipitation. In the last 3 years has been the highest level of precipitation by far in 100-year history. And the Edenville Dam just became so saturated with so much water behind it, it couldn't withstand it, obviously. MLive did a report this past week about the volume of water going into the lakes from the tributary rivers, and pointing out the Grand River already has sent more water to Lake Michigan than it normally does in an entire year. So I think those are some of the issues.
Yeah, so that question was actually from Bernie, and I'll just stay with him. He's asking the questions on Facebook, as you all can. Bernie was also asking about, we focused on phosphorus there in the CAFO segment. David Ruck, you produced that one. To what extent is nitrogen also a factor or being monitored to determine if it's a factor? David?
Sure, that's a great question. So my understanding is that phosphorus is sort of looked at for, how big is the bloom likely to be in a particular year? And nitrogen is something that's being looked at as how toxic is the bloom likely to be in a particular year. So while phosphorus is sort of creating the environment where cyanobacteria is likely to emerge and bloom, nitrogen is an element that Bowling Green State University and Ohio State University especially are looking at in terms of trying to be able to predict not just the size of the bloom, which Laura Johnson at Heidelberg is really good at doing with NOAA as well, but looking at, how likely is this bloom going to be a toxic bloom? So that's sort of emerging technology that both of those organizations, OSU, BGSU, are looking at right now. So they're trying to figure out, can we know where the bloom is toxic? Because, a large bloom could take over 600 square miles of the lake and not be, very toxic. But a small bloom could hover over the water intake and be extremely toxic. So these are definitely things that, as the technology improves, we should have a better understanding of, either in real time or predictively.
And you produced a segment for Great Lakes Now. It was in our April show where we looked at climate change across the Great Lakes. It was called Toxic Climate Conundrum. So I know that link is in the chat. Thank you to Colleen, our social media manager, for that. If people want to watch that one and get a look at those buoys. The CAFO segment definitely elicited a few questions and comments on Facebook. So I want to stay. One of them was about the right? We see the supply side with agriculture, but David, do you have any indication from your reporting and filming with farmers? Demand is there, obviously. Is it going up or down? Is it foreign or domestic? Do we know anything about that side, consumer side of things?
I don't have, that's a great question. I don't have any particular knowledge on where these particular products end up. I can't answer that.
Okay. But we know the demand is out there. What about the management side? David, we saw in there the farmers, working to manage. Let me ask you this, what's not in the segment that they say about using fields? What other kinds of conversations did you have with them?
I'm sorry, you cut out there for a second.
Oh, just asking on conversations with the farmers about manure usage. Do you get the feeling it's changing over time, or are they, we saw a couple people in the segment. What's not in the segment? What else have you been hearing?
Sure. Well, I guess, let's take the organic farmer, for example, that he's towards the tail end of that piece. I know, he has somewhere around 30 cows that he's using to produce milk, dairy, organic milk. His cows poop. He uses his cows poop to make corn, which then feeds those cows. So that's sort of like as much as one can have one, it is sort of a self-contained operation. He's not needing to move manure offsite. He doesn't have a high concentration of animals in one place that are creating an overabundance of manure that would be, overburden the soil that he then grows that food with for the cows with nutrients. So the problem with the CAFO is that you've just got this highly concentrated amount of animals that don't naturally live or would never naturally live in an area that small, and they're producing all of this waste that somebody has to do something with it. And as you see in the piece, the easiest thing to do is to have some sort of cash crop nearby. Maybe it's part of that same farm, and you use that manure that you're producing to fertilize that field. But you're probably doing more than just fertilizing that field, or at least giving it more nutrients than that field needs to be productive.
Yeah. And as we saw in the piece, there's a certain level of state regulation that goes with that. Rob Sisson, you're from the International Joint Commission. Can you talk about, I know, regulations of manure, right? This is what we all want to talk about at the end of the evening, but obviously it's an issue that impacts it comes from our food supplies as well. What can you tell us about manure management from the international perspective of the IJC?
Yeah, right. And in fact, in January, the IJC released a report called Manure Management in the Great Lakes. That's available at our website, ijc.org, and contains a lot of useful and helpful information, I think, to inform the public. We are the International Joint Commission, so we have to look at what's going on both sides of the boundary. And there's carrot and sticks approaches to conundrums like this. The governments could say, we're going to regulate this and you're going to do this, and then agricultural producers would just have to follow it or suffer whatever consequences. There are some carrot programs out there. Ohio is experimenting with a manure nutrient trading program that kind of rewards farmers to invest in things that help prevent runoff and reduce the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen running into water. One thing we looked at was each state has its own regulations and standards, each province does. And Ontario has regulations that kick in with about 300 animals. And as the gentleman in the segment mentioned, on the US side, most states, that's like 2,500 animals. So there's a disparity in the rules on sides of the boundary. We've not been asked to weigh in on harmonizing those, but that's one area I think the agriculture and governments need to get together and discuss.
We had another question come in relative to the CAFOs, and I think you answered some of it, but it's from Sandy, excellent name. And she wants to know what the research and government assessment on the impacts of the huge number of new and expanding CAFOs. So you kind of talked about the government assessment. Rob, to what extent is research helping the IJC and maybe state governments set those regulations and make decisions?
Well, again, we did our report, so we hope governments are tracking the report and using that information. There are a number of organizations that are doing work in this area. I know one area that's pretty exciting to me is fingerprinting the nutrients, where they can trace them to the actual farm. This is called non-point source pollution because it's hard to point the origination of it. But scientists are working on trying to fingerprint the phosphorus and nitrogen so they can track where it comes from and then address, maybe create a recipe for localities to help reduce that runoff.
So I want to ask David, because he is producing a full-length documentary about Lake Erie. David, to what extent are you seeing new or merging, different, like sort of what's the latest in research, whether it's at universities or elsewhere, towards some of those issues surrounding CAFOs and the pollutants in the water?
I want to reference the same documents that Rob just mentioned. Rob, where was that out of exactly? Because I remember, was that Heidelberg that was talking about being able to, I think Laura Johnson was talking about that fingerprinting ability. Is that where you got that from?
Yeah, well, okay, so this is the benefit of being able to archive this. We will look that up and we will put a link in the chat. I can tweet it out as well.
I will say that, one of the things that people need to consider, because farmers do make our food. If you're going to regulate farms in Ohio, you could make them less competitive to farms in Indiana or along the Mississippi basin, which dumps into the Gulf, and we have a huge dead zone in the Gulf, which is largely from the same sorts of practices that are leading to Lake Erie being green. So when you talk to folks that are really studying this issue, what they'll tell you is that you really need to develop national standards when it comes to CAFOs and manure and nutrient management. That's being one of the reasons why, so that you're not putting the farmer in Ohio out of business by, making their overhead either this much more or their margins this much thinner, while people in other watersheds aren't having to think about these kinds of things. So we really need to be looking at this, not just in Ohio, but on a national level.
So we have a question from Glenn on Facebook. Rob, I want to ask you this one. Glenn wants to know what plans are being made to address the hundreds, if not thousands, of earthen dams in the basement. Is the IJC getting into that level of dam management? This is going back, of course, to the Midland segment and the end of the show.
Yeah, no, we're not. We are involved in certain dams along the boundary that impact the levels and flows of waters that cross the boundary. These dams, like the Edenville Dam or even the Sturgis hydroelectric dam down in St. Joseph County, are not part of our oversight or purview. I do know that several states and the federal government, FERC, do keep an inventory, and it's something that is on the front burner for them. I know Michigan several years ago launched an inventory of all sorts of infrastructure to determine what the deferred maintenance price tag would be on all sorts of municipal infrastructures.
Yeah. So we have another question related to water costs and consumer. Are we paying? How are we going to pay for water? Our water bills, but also support the infrastructure that needs to be built to keep it safe among all the other demands on municipalities and state governments. Rob, I wonder if you could give us an example. We've heard a few things here, whether it's with dams, whether it's water quality, addressing the water levels. We've heard a few things that kind of speak to that idea of, is it the federal government? Is it Canada? Is it the United States? Is it these local municipalities? Can you give us an example of an issue or a problem that was solved where the IJC was involved, or you just witnessed it, where there really were a lot of levels of intergovernmental, cross-state cooperation? Are there success stories we can look at as models for any of this work?
Oh gosh, there are scores of examples, and the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement might be the best one because it ropes in all the states in the basin, all the communities, all the provinces, the federal governments. I was watching a documentary this morning that showed the Cuyahoga River on fire, which is kind of the famous example we all know about in the basin. We've made enormous strides by working together at federal, state, and local level. This one's a little bit different because when you make the initial investment in a water treatment plant or a hydroelectric dam, everyone buys into that and understands the benefits. But when that piece of infrastructure has been sitting there for 40 or 50, 60 years, it's very difficult to sell the value in investing in something that's been there for a long time to keep it up to date. And I think that's what a lot of communities are struggling with in asking their ratepayers or their taxpayers to fund these pretty enormous bills.
What can citizens do? What's the best way for people to get their message to their representatives or even to the IJC for their feelings on these issues? How can we advocate for ourselves, those of us who may be interested in water quality and telling government what to do, Rob?
Well, I'm ethically barred from telling people how to lobby Congress or the government, but they can reach us through our website. We have a comment section on our website. We have email addresses that citizens can reach us. And part of our responsibility and duties assigned to us by the two parties is to go out and listen to the public. So keep an eye, sign up at our website, keep an eye out for opportunities when we have public hearings or public meetings to weigh in and let us know what you're thinking. And in many ways, the citizens in the Great Lakes are our early warning system.
Okay. All right. Well, we hope that Great Lakes Now helps explain some of those issues. We can put some of the links to those messages, ways to send messages that Rob referenced. We'll put those in the chat as well. I see I have the Facebook feed going, so I can see Great Lakes Outreach Media is in the chat now as well. For those of you looking to keep updated on the information, you can also follow Great Lakes Now on Twitter. If you're specifically interested in WPBS, Tracy DuFlo, can you tell us how people can reach WPBS to get their thoughts known about issues in New York?
Sure. Our website is WPBSTV.org, and there's a contact section, and just click on my name and you can send me an email.
All right, thank you so much. So that was Tracy DuFlo from WPBS. I also would like to thank her along with Rob Sisson from the International Joint Commission. Thanks, Rob, for joining us tonight. David Ruck is with Great Lakes Outreach Media. He has produced for Great Lakes Now in a few different segments, and we're putting those in the chat as well. I really want to thank Colleen O'Donnell. She's our social media manager with Great Lakes Now, and she makes all of this magic happen. Rob Green is the supervising producer of our show. He puts all of that together for the half-hour program that airs on PBS stations around the region. And I want to thank Zach Allen. He's our technical engineer tonight, and I would call him the executive producer of this Facebook watch party, really co-executive producer along with Colleen. So thank you both so much. Thanks everyone for joining us online. Thank you to the audience and all of you who support public television. Hope you're members, hope you're getting your Passport app, and I hope you like the work we do. Please let us hear from you so we know what topics you're interested in, guests you'd like to hear from, things you'd like to see on the program. And with that, I will see you next month or at our next Facebook Live event, which will be August 7th. It's a Friday at noontime with the Belle Isle Aquarium here in Detroit. We're going to learn more about invasive species and see some of them up close. Thank you all so much on behalf of the whole Great Lakes Now team and Detroit Public Television and WPBS. Thanks for joining us.